a chance to look at those training sessions, you might get more out of the session today, or might spark some additional elements. So if we were to look at the whole area of learning experience design and some key elements related to it, the first three are obvious enough. Learning experience and design is very much in the title. And then beyond that, learning experience design, I guess, is very human-centered and is very goal-orientated. So the learning in learning experience design really is kind of a focus on the learner and the processes that the learners go through. So the intention of the whole learning element in learning experience design is really to try and kind of gather quite a holistic picture of learning and the different approaches which learning can take. And you can see kind of in that graphic on the right-hand side there, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but, you know, learning kind of is not just kind of throwing up PowerPoints to students. There's a whole range of different kind of areas, sub-areas, skills and knowledge, which is involved in good learning. And that can include philosophy, psychology, experiential learning, the whole pedagogical kind of approach to teaching, educational expertise, instructional design, so on and so forth. I suppose one key feature in terms of learning experience design is that notion of experience, that when we talk about kind of learning experience design, what we're really talking about is creating positive, engaging, effective experiences for students or for whatever type of learner. So when talking about learning experience design, the bit in the middle, experience, refers to anything which takes an amount of time to learn and leaves an impression. So it's important maybe to kind of consider, when we talk about learning experience design, it's important to consider that notion of an experience as central to the entire thing. And one kind of interesting point which learning experience does throw up is that experiences are not necessarily uniformly good or pleasant. It's not the case that every experience should be rainbows and gumdrops and sunshine. Some experiences, and kind of there's a very interesting field of study in this around transformational learning experiences, can be very painful, can cause a great deal of stress and kind of difficulty. But the suggestion is that through that stress, through that difficulty, through that effort, there is a benefit, and one does kind of extend oneself and kind of extend kind of, for instance, cognitive processing, you know, awareness of kind of task, perspective on kind of particular approaches. So I guess one key takeaway from this is that kind of when we talk about learning experience design, what we're really talking about is creating experiences. And one other consideration when we talk about an experience is it's not just when the student kind of walks into the class and kind of our responsibility ends when they walk back out of the class. The notion of an experience is that kind of there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it can be as kind of big or as small as we want it to be. So when we talk about an experience, it's important maybe to set out our own parameters on what that experience is. If I want to give my students a positive learning experience over while they take my module over the course of a semester, for instance, then, you know, that experience is going to begin before they come into the first live session, and it's going to continue after they exit the last live session. So the notion of an experience is just a slightly different, maybe slightly broader, more all-encompassing, more holistic way of looking at kind of students' engagement with you as a teacher. When we talk about design, then there's any number of different kind of interpretations of the whole area of design. Learning experience design is this notion that one works like a designer. Now, they can use the term designer. I'm not sure that kind of I would necessarily agree with their interpretation. Generally, kind of it involves kind of processes that would be familiar to all of us. So, for example, there would be elements of research, there would be elements of experimentation, of ideation, of testing. But there is this notion that there is maybe a mix of different kind of skill sets or kind of approaches or viewpoints when we do talk about design. And again, that's maybe reflected a bit in the graphic on the right in terms of, we could talk about interaction design, we could talk about user experience design, we could talk about industrial design, graphic design. So the area of design is not just nice looking slides. It goes well beyond that into kind of the processes that a designer would use. And kind of when you kind of get down into it, a lot of the processes that an interaction designer would use, or a UX designer would use, or a game designer or an industrial designer would use, they're all similar. They all do have kind of common characteristics. So the notion of design is not so much visual design, it's kind of working like a designer in terms of planning out what is to be done, sequencing things, learning about your target audience, experimenting, testing, so on and so forth. Human-centered means viewing learning as a human process, and I guess ideally a social one too. So this kind of goes back to what maybe was mentioned a bit in terms of an experience and the need to put your learner at the center of a design process. So the whole thing is very kind of human-centered. It's focused on the learner as an individual. And that might necessitate sometimes a bit of a move away from very traditional ways of teaching and learning. That involves kind of, I suppose, and it's something which was referenced in the previous slide when we talked about design, to a certain degree, that kind of requires understanding your learner, what motivates them, what drives them, what appeals to them. Not necessarily that we have to cater to what they like or what will appeal to them most, but I think having an awareness of them, of their context, of their situation, potentially of their limitations or what can be reasonably expected or not expected from them. And that notion of being human-centered really means that kind of identifying the learner as a human being and being aware of, you know, what they as a human being require or kind of are expecting or are able to do. So developing an awareness of the learner and kind of their unique kind of circumstances and viewpoints. And then a key element as well in learning experience design is that it is goal orientated. So it's kind of human centered, but there is a focus on reaching a particular goal, and choosing the right goals is essential to the process. And I suppose for us in kind of higher education, certainly the goal is nearly always, I think, within MTU Cork going to be related to the learning outcomes for this particular module. So that is a very clear set of goals, which I think the entire process is kind of driven by and aims for. But if one was to kind of expand that remit a bit, maybe there are additional kind of goals which you want for your learners beyond just reaching the learning outcomes. Maybe it's preparing them for the workplace. Maybe it's kind of your learning or kind of your teaching process, making them more positive in a societal or in a kind of within their own confidence in themselves. So the whole notion of goal orientated is kind of taken care of for us by virtue of kind of teaching in MTU Cork, but there is going to be additional or there may be, depending on how much you're willing to how much you're willing to suffer yourself around what else you want to kind of give your learners as part of the learning process. So the entire kind of learning experience design process then is kind of represented a small bit like this, and between those different quadrants we can see that there are these different kind of areas which we referred to earlier. So I suppose that's just a very kind of broad overview of the whole learning experience design thought process or kind of concept. If we were to look at particular methodologies and approaches related to learning experience design, well, there are quite a few of them. Apologies, my slides aren't loading for some reason there. So when we talk about different kind of learning experience design methodologies, there's any number of these available. So some relatively kind of famous ones are, some relatively famous ones include that one there by Rosenheck and all. And that is very much kind of a learning experience design process, which is focused on kind of, as they would put it, the workplace. So there is this notion of, for example, learning science and also knowledge harvesting from employees and so on and so forth. There are additional kind of processes, such as the one kind of represented here by iDesign, and there's this learning experience development process model. But where a lot of these different methodologies maybe kind of come from is the whole area of design thinking. And design thinking, as identified by Tim Brown there, is basically an approach to problem solving in which inspiration ideation, and implementation occur not not in sequence, but as a system of overlapping spaces. So I suppose maybe just some observations around design thinking to be aware of is that there's no one specific approach to design thinking. It's not a it's not it's not that there's a single kind of methodology or kind of way of performing design thinking. It's more of a different kind of way of thinking as opposed to a specific academic discipline. And as identified by Richard Buchanan there, if you ask 10 people what service design is, you'd come up with 11 different answers. For anyone interested, there is a fantastic certificate in designing innovative services, which is an online course available in MTU Cork, which is offered by the Department of Accounting and Information Systems, and the course coordinator is Fred Creedon. I'm a graduate of that course myself, and I really can't recommend it highly enough. It's extremely useful as a way of kind of getting used to and kind of gathering information on design teaching, which I found particularly useful, and something which is excuse me, my slides are kind of acting up on me, but I just found kind of the cert in designing innovative services something which I could plug into pretty much anything and everything that I do within my kind of job at MTU Cork, and that includes lecturing. So I really can't recommend that kind of strongly enough. One kind of learning experience design methodology or tool which might be quite useful, however, is called the LX Canvas. And the notion of the LX Canvas is it's basically just kind of a set of guidelines or a structure to help you to plan out, design, and then develop effective learning experience for students. And the way that it does this, it's represented in this kind of visual fashion here, but essentially you could just think of this about just a Word document that you put together yourself, where you're just putting down information that will help guide you into offering learners the best possible experience. So it has a nice visual design here, but I mean, you could really just think of it as a Word document and it will work equally effectively. So the notion with the LX Canvas is really that there are these different sections to it. And the idea is very simply that if we add in information to these different sections in a particular sequence, it will help inform the decisions we make, which will help us provide the best possible learning experience to our learners. Now, this is something which I think a huge amount of staff in MTU Cork have done or do very regularly. But it may be at more of a subconscious level. There may be an element of autopilot to it, because if you have been teaching for quite a while, then you probably are very able to, fill in this information without necessarily having to put a huge amount of thought into it. So I found one of the benefits of the learning experience canvas is really just that it kind of, I suppose, structured the process for me and helped me put down on paper the different kind of considerations, sequences, and approaches that I could use to give students the best possible learning experience. So for me, and I think for certainly the vast majority of teaching staff in MTU Cork, it's not that this is going to be anything particularly new, but it maybe might be a useful guide just in helping you to identify maybe areas for improvements or slightly different activities which could be offered to learners. And a lot of the information here is kind of things that you really won't have to rack your brains about too much. I think it's information that will come to most of us quite quickly and easily, simply by virtue of the fact that it's information we've already had to, for the most part, figure out just to kind of be able to deliver a module effectively. But in looking at the LX Canvas, a couple of different kind of areas which would require information. The first is maybe the learning outcomes, and obviously those can be the module learning outcomes. Following on from that then are learning objectives. Now, I know obviously in third level there's we would be aware of the difference between learning outcomes and learning objectives. In this particular instance, learning objectives really refers to specific goals needed to achieve the learning outcome. And you can identify those here, for instance, as behavior, learner behaviors that you want to inculcate, learner insights you want to present, and the skills and knowledge that the learners should develop. So a bit different to the kind of learning outcomes, lest there be any confusion about that. People then would refer to all people who take part. And I suppose one thing to bear in mind is maybe that it is not just us and the learners that are the people involved. You can consider, I suppose it depends on how broad you want to make your remit. But for example, very little of this will go on without the fantastic services provided by IT services, without the support students get from their student union, without the career counseling which might be available to them. So people, and again, I think this kind of refers back to the notion of creating an experience that maybe goes beyond the class, when the class begins and when the class ends. But the people could be all the people who take part. And I suppose by putting down that long list of people involved, that can maybe help kind of spark new ideas, new kind of benefits for students, new kind of approaches, new ways of doing things. Characteristics then might refer to what motivates or improves learners. So if you do have kind of an awareness of your learners, then the characteristics can help you to maybe, again, just by putting it down on paper, maybe just to kind of think about and to kind of, what drives learners, what motivates them, what encourages them, what deflates them. And kind of by, again, just by having that information on paper, it can spark additional thoughts, additional kind of awareness, or kind of new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at teaching and learning activities. When we talk about the environment, we kind of identify how environments which influence how interaction will happen. And again, this is kind of maybe something more for your own decision making in terms of how big or how small you may wish to make this. You might want to go with this information, but you could think about the physical environment, which unfortunately is not massively available to a lot of us at the moment, the virtual environments where learning can happen. And that doesn't have to just be on Canvas. That could be through Zoom, that could be through email, that can be through blogs, any number of social media, potentially any number of different areas. And you can think about the social environments that you might share with students, or that students might share with each other, and the cultural kind of environments. Location then is really where the experiences will take place. So if interaction is what happens in the environment, then location is where the learning will actually happen. And again, you can think about this in terms of not just kind of one space. So for example, I was going to say a year ago, but it's further back than that even, when we were all still kind of physically on campus, that will be within the classroom, but it might also be on Canvas. It might be through Zoom. It might be over email. It might be all these additional locations where these learning experiences will happen. Constraints very broadly just refers to the limitations that you and your learners might be facing. And resources kind of refers to everything available at your disposal. So maybe it's important as well to consider resources, not just in terms of what MTU Cork provides, but also what you yourself have, what the learners themselves have. And the notion is, by filling out these kind of 8 different kind of areas, the learning outcomes, objectives, people, characteristics, environments, locations, constraints, and resources, that then can help inform the strategy. And the suggestion in terms of developing the strategy for the learning experience canvas is, as is identified there, to think like a programmer. So in programming, there is this notion of if then. And what that basically means is to kind of think about things in a very kind of logical, sequential way. So if we can't meet in a physical classroom, then we'll have to meet in a virtual classroom. If Zoom isn't available to me, or if Zoom is, Zoom is not going to be available, then I will have to maybe put out a recording at a later date. So that's really kind of top of the head stuff, but there is that suggestion that kind of when you're figuring out your strategy based on the information you've put together from these 8 different elements, then kind of thinking about it in that logical, sequential way can maybe help you to kind of identify, find solutions to certain items which might be kind of arising here. So for example, based on your restraints, you can maybe look at those very much with an if-then kind of approach. If this is a constraint, then what can I do to overcome it? Following on from the strategies, then the notion with the strategy is that then can inform activities and processes. So activities is essentially the kind of I guess I don't really need to explain those. They're you do, what the learners do in order to reach the learning outcomes or the learning objectives. Processes within the Canvas then refer to the learning experience as it happens over time. And the important thing to think about those is, as is identified there, the devil is in the details when it comes to that. So when will it take place? How long will it take place? Where will it take place? In what order will these different kind of processes happen? So that's a real kind of rush job through the learning experience canvas. But I would say it can be quite a useful process. And again, maybe don't get too hung up on how this is kind of presented here. You could think about this as a Word document with a header that says learning outcomes, another header that says learning objectives with subheaders for behavior, insight. And the idea with the learning experience canvas really is just kind of, it's almost like a brainstorming device. It's just a way of putting down all the information which can help inform the learning experience in one place so that you can maybe make sense of it, sift through it. And again, there is that notion, hopefully it's some way kind of visible even in this kind of graphic, that kind of your learning outcomes help inform your learning objectives, your people help inform the characteristics, and all of that helps to inform the strategy, which informs the activities, which informs the processes. So if anyone is interested in more in kind of getting a copy of the learning experience canvas, we can certainly send out a PDF to you around this. Some other considerations then, just I suppose in conjunction with the learning experience canvas, is the successive approximation model. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, but the idea with the successive approximation model is basically it's an approach towards designing and developing learning experiences. I guess in particular, asynchronous learning experiences, such as what one might produce with H5P. And the idea with the SAM model is that it is this kind of very kind of broad, very kind of lean kind of approach in terms of development. But I would say you maybe don't have to worry too much about this kind of approach to the SAM model. There is a more basic version, which is presented like this. And the idea with the SAM approach is really just that one might go through a number of kind of iterative kind of phases of evaluation, design, and development. So hopefully that graphic even kind of visually represents that somewhat. This notion that, okay, I'm going to start the process and I'm going to start off with an evaluation. Once I have that kind of analysis done, I can begin designing. Once I'm finished my design, I can begin developing. But then it doesn't just kind of end. The sequence kind of repeats. I'm going to begin the kind of second loop with evaluating what I've done, seeing how effective that is, and then beginning another process of design and development before kind of finishing. So if we were to look at that as kind of an initial sequence, one might evaluate by a quick analysis of the situation and goals. Who are the learners? What needs to change? What do they know now? What can I do for them? And again, the learning experience canvas can inform a huge amount of this. Following on from that, the first design phase might involve a very quick design inside, not even inside an H5P, but maybe even on pen and paper, just to try and kind of put some kind of shape or some kind of form on what it is you're going to develop. So you might think about kind of listing and organizing goals, listing learning outcomes, listing ways learners can be appraised, and you might sketch out a few kind of sample ideas. So the point of this is really to kind of work in pen and paper format, but before moving on to any kind of digital development. And then development would really just kind of, the first iteration of development would focus on just producing very rough prototypes, working, for lack of a better term, very kind of quick and very kind of dirty, resisting the urge, as is identified there, to do something fancy or to try and make something very, very usable. The idea with the whole kind of SAM approach really is that you don't do this loop just the one time, you do it a number of times. So if you're to think about even doing it 3 times, the point of the first iteration, that first phase of evaluation, design, and development, is really just to try and get something down, put some kind of rough shape on something. And in the second iteration, you can improve upon what you've done. And in the third iteration, you can improve upon what you've done in the second iteration. So working in that kind of loop or that kind of series of iterations, it's important not to try and get everything right the first time around, or to get too hung up on making the first go the kind of final product. The idea is that you try and limit the amount of time and energy you put into it, because you're aware that there's kind of you're going to do a second iteration or a third iteration or a fourth or a fifth or a sixth iteration. So the idea with this approach is really that kind of you work very kind of quick and kind of rough, and that kind of the repeated iteration, the repeated loops is how things get polished, and that's what makes them more effective.